Good morning, everybody. Welcome to World Without Rule of Law. Thanks for listening. Today, I want to just tell you briefly about a new story that I'm developing. It's similar to the EMP series, yet completely different. The similarities include it's a group of Christians trying to survive in a post collapse situation. However, the collapse is not an EMP. It doesn't come from an EMP, it comes from a financial collapse. And they're in a church in New York City. And unlike the EMP series, where they bug in and they develop infrastructure and procedures and survival in that church compound, in this story, they're there shortly and they realize pretty quickly that they cannot sustain life there, as it is in the Queensboro of New York City. And so they bug out to a different location. And so as I say, it's different. It is based on a group of Christians that are at a church. That's the main similarity, I guess. And from my point of view, like, what better group to have is, your brothers and sisters in the Lord. So I think in that situation, that's a good place to start. So I just want to read a few minutes, probably 6 minutes or so, of that story. Now, I'm going to just pick it up in the area of chapter 3, not at the beginning of chapter 3, but just well into chapter 3. And as I said, I'm going to read 6 minutes. Thanks for listening. And then after, when I'm done, we'll talk about some channel transitions and some ideas I have going forward. The church had an emergency generator with 500 gallons of fuel. After the collapse, the power remained on for a while until the lack of money caused the infrastructures to begin to fail. After the grocery stores, banks, and other private businesses closed down, it wasn't long until the utilities shut down. Cable television was first, followed by the phone and private internet service providers. Then, finally, about 2 months after the collapse, the power grid started to go down. Pastor had ordered the generators to run for 2 hours each morning and an hour each evening to conserve fuel. This gave everyone an opportunity to use the showers until the public water supply failed, as well as run space heaters and small appliances. They had a chest freezer which, when ran for that time, would get cold enough to keep the food frozen if left closed. It was only open to retrieve food just prior to the run time each morning. The fuel tank on the generator had just under 30 gallons left in it now. It was siphoned out into jerry cans and strapped down to the roof rack on the bus. Meanwhile, Pastor Isaac Rubens went to the communications room, which was nothing more than a large closet in the foyer, and fired up the ham radio. In the village, near the DeMarco farm, there was a sheriff who worked out of his home. He covered a very large region, and the county had cut the funding for his job shortly after the collapse. He was 63 years old and scheduled to retire in 1 month. The young deputy, who he was grooming to take over for him, quit when the county stopped paying them. He was a young man with a young family that needed him. The sheriff couldn't blame him one bit. In an effort to keep order in the area, the sheriff continued to do his sworn duty, even in the absence of a salary. As far as anyone knew, he could make one radio call to the county and summon the forces needed to quell any situation that might arise. In truth, he was alone, isolated with no support from the county or state. To him, the oath he took to uphold the law and the Constitution still meant everything. Now, when the community needed his service more than ever, how could he abandon them? He heard the radio in his living room crackle to life. He recognized the voice of Isaac Rubens, a man he had never met. They spoke about once a month, and he was not due to call for another 2 weeks, and the sheriff was surprised to hear from him. Isaac told them that they were implementing their plan. Leaving in the morning, should be there by mid-afternoon, he said. The sheriff advised him to use back roads as much as possible as he got further north. The bridge on the highway 20 miles south washed out in a flash flood a month back, he informed Pastor Rubens. Okay, well, hopefully we'll make it there by nightfall then, he answered. The sheriff promised to let Pete know, and they signed off. Although cell and internet services were down, the Department of Homeland Security had updated the repeater systems over the past 10 years. The batteries could hold a charge for months, depending on usage time. Many states and counties added the capability of charging the batteries with solar panels placed on the towers. Looters had stolen some of them, but many were in areas that were remote or inaccessible to them. There were enough left in the system that it still operated. Depending on where you were trying to reach, transmissions could be sketchy, but the link between the village and Queens was usually operational. The sheriff had a late model Ford Explorer sitting in his driveway. He chose instead to drive his personal 1981 Harley-Davidson Electric Glide in an effort to conserve fuel. He knew in the back of his mind that someday in the near future he would be forced to use a horse for transportation once the gas storages were depleted. There certainly was no shortage of those in the area. He rode up onto the DeMarco homestead about 40 minutes later. He pulled the Harley around back and dismounted. Pete could see him out his rear window and yelled, "Bobby, come on in." The sheriff walked in and went over to stand by the wood stove to warm himself. Pete was finishing up his lunch and got up and slid a chair over toward the sheriff. "What brings you out, Bobby?" he asked. The sheriff told Pete about the radio call from Isaac. Pete pondered it for a moment. "You hungry?" Pete asked. "I got a pot of chili on the stove." "That sounds real good, Pete. Don't mind if I do." Pete placed a large bowl next to him and instructed him to help himself. "Don't be shy. We got plenty," Pete said. The sheriff took off his leather coat, which came all the way down to cover his knees, and hung it on a hook by the door. He took off his knit cap and stuck it in the cargo pocket in the leg of his BDU trousers. The cap was olive drab, with an American flag velcroed to it. Bobby Knight was a Vietnam vet. He served 2 tours as a Marine in country from 1971 and 1973. He quit school the day he turned 17 and joined the Corps. The cap was from the following generation's war, but he liked how it fit and how it kept his head warm. After lunch, Bobby and Pete went out to cut and split the pile of firewood that Pete had brought up from the woods that morning. They were good friends, and Pete liked Bobby's company. He always found whatever excuse he could use to feed or otherwise help supply the sheriff. He knew that the county had cut his salary off. He also knew Bobby wouldn't tell anyone or ask anyone for help. Bobby had a pretty horrific time in Vietnam. He actually spent 2 months in a bamboo cage underwater up to his chin. The cage was not tall enough for him to stand up completely in, and at the same time too narrow for him to sit down, which he couldn't have done anyway because it would have placed him fully underwater. They moved him around regularly from camp to camp. On one such slog through the jungle, he seized his opportunity to escape. While crossing a river 40 feet above on a rickety rope bridge with his hands bound behind him, he launched himself over the edge and into the raging torrent below. The guards that were moving him fired several volleys at him, but never hit him. He nearly drowned, but managed to get to shore downstream. He made his way for 13 days through the jungle until a patrol of Americans picked him up near the Cambodian border. He hadn't eaten in all that time, and he stayed hydrated by sucking moisture from off of palm leaves in the jungle, his hands tied behind him the entire time. After he received his orders to return home, he sat alone in silent contemplation during the plane ride back to the States. He quietly and solemnly thanked God for delivering him from this terrible ordeal. As he looked out the plane window into the jungle he would hopefully never see again, couldn't help notice that this place that had brought him so much pain, so much misery, was actually a very beautiful country. As he prayed thanks to God, he promised God and himself that he would never ask for anything ever again. Every day for the rest of his life was a gift